Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Labor Party, as my colleague the Honourable Clayton Cosgrove has already indicated, supports this notice of motion because it is one of the few ways in which we're going to have at least a modicum of transparency as to what's happening at Mighty River Power now that half of it is being privatised. Mr Speaker, we've already had this is only necessary because the government has already taken them off the list of state-owned enterprises because of the privatisation. Until that step was taken, of course, New Zealanders had the ability through their members of parliament to scrutinise the affairs of Mighty River Power. That was taken away through the decision of the government to stop them being a state-owned enterprise as part of their program of selling half of the shares. We've already heard earlier this year from the Chief Ombudsman, Beverly Wakeham, complaining that the government got it wrong in removing the state-owned enterprises and these companies, half of which was being sold from the group of entities that are covered by the Official Information Act. She pointed out that one of the reasons why you have transparency around these things is to prevent cronyism and corruption. And if ever there's a government in the history of New Zealand that is going down the road of cronyism, which is related to the rise of corruption and democracy, it's this one. We've seen sweet deals negotiated at the highest levels of government involving the Prime Minister for the Sky City Convention Centre, for the Rio Tinto subsidy of $30 million, which I will come back to for reasons relating to the electricity markets, and then most recently the intervention following the chair of Chorus phoning the Prime Minister complaining about the draft determination from the Commerce Commission into copper broadband pricing for Chorus, leading to the government intervening for the benefit of that company. Mr Speaker, the Chief Ombudsman was quite right in pointing out that it was wrong to remove Mighty River Power from the list of entities that are subject to the Official Information Act. The excuse that was used by the government that these companies are commercial or more commercial because they have some private shareholders does not hold water because, of course, disclosure can already be refused under the Official Information Act where matters of commercial confidentiality applies. So, Mr Speaker, it is important that we have transparency and openness. I want to give another example of how, through this process of SOE sales, we've had too little of it. At the time of the last election, the Labor Party spotted that the National Party were promising in their fiscal projections to sell off government assets, the likes of Mighty River Power, bank the money and therefore not have as much borrowing and have lower interest costs.
That's right.
What they didn't do was account for the fact that they lost dividends and shares of capital growth as a consequence of that sale. Right. So they banked the savings, but they didn't take into account the extra costs that they would have as a consequence, or the lower revenue they would have as a consequence of no longer owning all of these companies. At the time, Stephen Joyce, this master spin doctor from the government, was rolled out to accuse the Labor Party of lying, of misrepresenting. He did that through the New Zealand Herald, he did it through the television channels, he went all over radio, and we've got his big sort of sword out and tried to pretend that we had it wrong when in fact we were right. And it was an absolute indictment on not only the National Party and Stephen Joyce that they were willing to misrepresent to the people. They did, on this occasion, they did lie to the electorate. They lied to the electorate as to what would be the fiscal effects of selling down interests in these companies, and the Treasury did not force them to come clean. The Treasury, in my opinion, in breach of the public finance legislation, allowed the Minister of Finance to sign off on a set of accounts that didn't show that, notwithstanding that the pre-election fiscal update, for the sake of transparency and openness, is meant to present a solid set of accounts, and we know that's necessary when you've got national governments, because that's what really led to that was the debacle under Mr Muldoon when he left things in such a poor state of affairs all those years ago. So we've had this lack of transparency and openness around the Mighty River Power and other share floats. We've had the removal of them from the Official Information Act, and now we have at least this little glimmer of hope that we in the Labour Party can at least at financial review look into these accounts and criticise. What we can't do is undo what the government's doing with these asset sales. We can't reverse the huge salaries and bonuses that are being paid to the chief executives of these companies that are being floated, increasing the costs that have to be charged to power consumers. We can't change the money that's been wasted on the process, many hundreds of millions of dollars in terms of advice and commissions being paid on sale. And we ought not to forget that this is central to the National Party's economic agenda for this 3 years, even though it's opposed by so many New Zealanders, and yet it does nothing to improve New Zealand's economic output. Changing who owns what already exists doesn't change how much electricity is produced. All it does is put up the price. Now, the government's always telling us that, look, we've got a competitive electricity price that market that constrains price, and yet we know that New Zealanders don't believe that because it's not true. We know that New Zealand electricity prices have increased at twice the rate of inflation now for about 20 years. We know that the differential between residential and commercial and industrial tariffs is second highest in the developed world after Denmark and can't be properly explained except by a lack of competition. And we've even in the last few weeks had another intervention by the government in respect of the Meridian share sale to get Meridian off the block. They did a deal with the owners of the smelter. They gave a $30 million subsidy to Rio, effectively for the benefit of Rio Tinto, in order to give certainty for Meridian that they'd still be able to sell their power at inflated prices and keep the price high. We know that but for that intervention, the Treasury advised that the price of electricity could have decreased for everyone by 10%. And yet they pretend that we've got a competitive electricity market. I just find it absolutely incredible that we haven't had outrage from the investment bankers from this market intervention by the government, which proved that the electricity market was not competitive. But the reason we haven't had outrage from that quarter is, of course, they are self-interested in getting in keeping the existing so-called market model, because it's certainly not a competitive market model, it's an uncompetitive market model, but they are self-interested because they want to clip the ticket on these sales. They like the privatisation of these assets. They are some of those who benefit from the sell-down of these assets to less than 3% of the New Zealand population owning what was previously wholly New Zealand-owned. Mr. Speaker, this program on the part of the government is wrong. We do support this notice of motion. We don't think the government should be given much credit for it because, of course, whilst they're doing this, which is the absolute minimum they can do, they're running roughshod over the will of New Zealanders. Citizens-initiated referenda are provided for under the constitutional arrangements of New Zealand. Where a citizens-initiated referendum is brought forward and the more than 300,000 signatures that are needed to cross that hurdle are obtained, then it should be a prudent government would say, if there was no urgency in respect of the issue that was so contentious, if there was no urgency to proceed, and there isn't urgency to proceed with the likes of Meridian sale, you just wait and see what the referendum turns up.
Respect the people.
You'd respect the people, and you would give due consideration to the outcome of that referendum. This arrogant government, of course, is just ignoring the will of the people, pretending that they've got a mandate for this when they haven't, ignoring the fact that it makes the finances of the government worse, ignoring the fact that it increases the gap between the rich and the poor, ignoring the fact that it makes the economy go slower if you've got a higher electricity price because your businesses aren't as competitive and they can't employ as many people, ignoring the fact that it has an adverse effect on the wealth of the country because you don't have as many exports and you import more stuff instead if your energy price is higher than need it be. They are doing all of that because of this ideologically driven nonsense of selling these shares in not just Mighty River Power, but also Meridian. So while the Labour Party supports this notice of motion, let that not be confused as getting any support for this ridiculous central part of the government's economic agenda.
That's right. Well,